The morning was quiet, and the sky above the cemetery was a soft gray. The grass was wet with dew, and the cold wind moved slowly through the trees. Mr. Richard Langston stepped out of his black car, dressed in a dark suit and long overcoat. He was a tall man with silver hair and tired eyes. His driver stayed behind, knowing his boss always wanted to be alone at this place. Richard walked down the path with slow steps, holding a small bouquet of white flowers in one hand. He didn't speak a word, but his heart was heavy. It had been 2 years since the accident, since he lost his only son, Michael. Every month, he came here to visit the grave. Always on the same day, always in silence. The gravestone was simple and clean. It had Michael's name and the short words Richard had chosen himself. Beloved son, gone too soon. Richard knelt in front of the grave and placed the flowers gently at its base. He stared at the stone, not really seeing it, just lost in thought. So many regrets filled his chest, regrets for the times they fought, for the calls he didn't answer, for the words he never said. Michael had been young, full of dreams, but he was also wild, always chasing something, always running from something too. They hadn't been close in the end, and Richard had always blamed himself. A sound broke the silence, soft crying, coming from somewhere nearby. Richard turned his head just a little, trying not to intrude at first. He thought he was imagining it, but the sound grew clearer. Soft sobs and a child's quiet voice. Just a few feet away, sitting under a tree not far from his son's grave, was a young black woman. She was dressed in plain clothes, jeans, simple shirt, and a thick coat. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her face was hidden in her hands. Beside her sat a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. His hands were small, and he clutched a single flower that looked like it had been picked from the cemetery's edge. Richard watched them for a moment, unsure what to think. He had never seen them here before. He didn't want to stare, but something about the woman's sadness pulled at him. She cried like someone who had lost everything, and the boy just sat there, looking confused but quiet, like he had seen his mother cry too many times before. The boy glanced up and saw Richard. Their eyes met for a second. The boy didn't smile, didn't speak. He just looked at him, blinking slowly. Then, he turned back to the woman and rested his head against her arm. Richard's heart beat faster. He didn't understand why, but there was something strange, something too familiar about that child's face, the eyes, the shape of the nose. It reminded him of someone. A whisper of memory stirred inside him, but it didn't make sense. He stood still, wanting to walk over, but unsure if it was right. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable. She didn't look like someone who wanted company, just a tired mother with a broken heart, and yet something inside Richard told him not to walk away. The woman finally noticed him. She wiped her face quickly and whispered something to the boy. Then she stood up and took his hand. She started to walk away, her steps fast, her head down. Richard didn't speak, just watched, unsure if he should say anything at all. But as they passed, the little boy turned his head again and looked at Richard one more time. This time, he spoke. Just a soft question that floated in the cold air. "Mom, why is that man crying too?" The woman froze for just a second. Richard's eyes widened, but he still said nothing. The woman gently pulled the boy's hand and continued walking without answering him. They disappeared around the curve of the cemetery path, leaving Richard standing there with the question hanging in his mind. He looked back at his son's grave, then down the path where the woman and child had gone. His hands trembled slightly. The feeling in his chest was something he hadn't felt in years. Not since the day he got the call about Michael's accident. He didn't know who that woman was or why she had come to cry so close to his son's grave. But something told him this wasn't a random meeting. Something told him he would see her again. And when he did, everything in his life would change. Richard didn't sleep well that night. he lay awake in his giant, empty bedroom. The silence around him louder than ever. The boy's words kept echoing in his mind. Why is that man crying too? It was a simple question, but it had torn something open inside him. He hadn't cried in public in years. But the boy saw straight through him. The next morning, Richard canceled all his meetings. His secretary was surprised. It wasn't like him to take sudden breaks, but he didn't explain. He just said he needed a personal day. No one questioned him. After all, he was the boss. The billionaire who owned 3 companies and half the buildings on the block. But money meant nothing when your heart was heavy. Richard didn't know what he was looking for. But he drove alone through the city, stopping at every small diner or coffee shop near the cemetery, just hoping he might see her again after 4 hours of driving. He pulled into a quiet little place off the highway. It had a faded sign that said Marlene's Diner. He almost didn't go in, but something told him to try one more. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The smell of old coffee, fried eggs, and toast filled the air. And there she was, behind the counter. Wearing a dark green apron, her hair tied back again, was the same woman he had seen crying near his son's grave. She didn't see him right away. She was too busy wiping a table, talking softly to an older customer. But Richard froze near the door, his heart racing. What was he supposed to do now? Walk up and say, "Hello, I saw you crying near my son's grave." No, that would scare her, maybe even offend her. So he sat down at the booth near the window, far enough to not crowd her, close enough to observe, and he waited a few minutes. Passed. Then she walked over with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a small notepad in hand. "Good morning. Can I get you something?" She asked gently. Her voice was calm but tired. Like someone who'd been through too much for her age, Richard cleared his throat. "Just coffee, please, Black," he said, trying to sound normal. She nodded and turned to go, but he spoke again. "Have we met before?" She paused, her back still turned halfway, her shoulders stiffened slightly, then relaxed. "I don't think so," she said. Not meeting his eyes, she brought the coffee to the table a moment later and placed it down. Carefully. "Here you go, sir. Anything else?" "You were at the cemetery," he said softly, watching her face. Her hands froze for a second on the coffee pot. She didn't look at him, but he saw her jaw tighten. "You had a little boy with you," he added. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. I was just visiting someone important to me." She took a deep breath, then finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark and guarded. "I remember," she said quietly. "It's okay. I didn't mean to cry so close to your space. We didn't know anyone else would be there. It's—" "Not that," Richard said quickly. "It's just your son. He reminded me of someone." She looked confused, maybe even a little defensive. "My son?" She asked. "He's just a kid. We don't usually go there. It was a special day." "I see," Richard said, taking a sip of coffee. "He looks a lot like my son did when he was that age." Now she froze, her eyes locked on him. "Searching for something. Your son," she repeated. "What's his name?" "Michael." Richard's hand almost dropped the cup. The way she said the name, soft, full of memory, told him everything. "Yes," he whispered. "Michael Langston." She sat down across from him without asking. Her hands trembled slightly. As she wiped them on her apron, "I didn't mean to bring trouble. I swear, I didn't come for anything. I didn't want anyone to know." "Know what?" Richard asked, even though he was starting to understand. She looked away, then back again. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't want to fall. "My name's Alina," she said. "I knew your son. Years ago, a long time ago." Richard's throat was tight. He couldn't breathe properly. "And the boy?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. She nodded, slowly. "His name is Micah," she whispered. "He's Michael's son." For a moment, the diner seemed to go completely still. Richard stared at her, at the truth settling into his bones. The little boy who looked so familiar was his grandson. The boy his son never told him about. The boy he didn't even know existed. And the woman in front of him, just a stranger an hour ago, now held the biggest secret of his life. Elena didn't plan to say anything. She had kept the truth hidden for years. Not for her sake, but for Micah's. She didn't want the boy to grow up feeling rejected, unwanted by a family that never knew he existed. But now here she was, sitting in a diner booth with the father of the man she once loved, and everything she had protected was now cracking wide open. Richard sat in silence, his hand resting on the edge of the table. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her as if the world had stopped spinning. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photo, one that was wrinkled from being touched too often. She slid it across the table. It was a picture of Michael, younger, smiling with his arm around a very pregnant Elena. Richard reached out with shaking fingers, picked up the photo, and stared at it for a long time. There were no words, just a slow breath leaving his chest as the truth became undeniable. He knew, Elena said softly. He knew about Micah. He wanted to be there. He planned to come back for us. But then, he didn't get the chance. Richard blinked fast, his eyes filling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pain mixed with guilt. "He never told me," he whispered. "We hadn't spoken in months before he died. I didn't even know where he'd been. He was scared," Elena said. "He told me your family had plans for him, big plans, and I didn't fit into them." Richard looked down, shame coloring his face. It was true. Back then, he had pushed Michael into business, into politics, into a life his son never wanted. He never asked what Michael wanted for himself, never gave him the space to choose. And Micah? He asked slowly, "Does he know?" "He knows his father died before he could meet him," Elena said, "but I never told him who your family was. I didn't want him growing up feeling less than, or like he wasn't good enough." Richard looked away, his jaw tight. "He's not less than anything," he said firmly. "If he's Michael's son, then he's a Langston, no matter what." Elena stared at him, unsure how to feel. "I'm not asking for money," she said quickly. "I don't want anything from you. Raised him alone for 6 years, and we've done fine." "I believe you," Richard replied. "But this isn't about money. It's about blood. It's about a boy who's part of my son, part of me." There was a long pause between them. Outside the diner, a truck rumbled by. Inside, the coffee machine hissed quietly. Lena wiped her hands on her apron again, then stood. "I need to get back to work," she said softly. "My shift ends at 3. Then I pick up Micah from school. May I come with you?" Richard asked, surprising even himself, just to see him again. Elena hesitated, then nodded once. "All right," she said, "but don't scare him. He's just a little boy." "I promise," Richard said, standing too. "I'll be gentle." Hours passed slowly, and Richard sat quietly in the back of the diner until Elena's shift ended. Then they drove in separate cars to a small school on the edge of town. Richard stayed by the gate, trying not to attract attention, when the bell rang. Children came pouring out of the building in a wave of laughter and backpacks. And then, there he was. Micah came walking out with a paper in one hand and a half-eaten cookie in the other. His coat was a little big for him, and his shoes had scuffs. But his face was bright and curious. Elena knelt to hug him, brushing his hair from his eyes. She whispered something to him, and he looked over at Richard. Micah stared at the man with a puzzled expression, then whispered, "That's the man." From the grave, Richard smiled gently. He walked a few steps closer and knelt so he wasn't towering over the boy. "Hello, Micah," he said softly. "It's nice to meet you again." Micah tilted his head, then said, "Are you a friend?" "Of my mommy." Richard looked at Elena, then back at the boy. "I'd like to be," he said. "Would you like that?" Micah nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, then added, "You look like the man in my picture book, the one who stands with the lion." Richard laughed quietly, his heart swelling in a way he hadn't felt since Michael was small. "I'm not that brave," he said, "but maybe I'll grow into it." Alina watched the two of them, her heart tight in her chest. She hadn't expected it to go this way. She had expected anger, denial, or worse, silence. But instead, here was this man, a billionaire, humbling himself in front of her son. Not out of duty, but something else. Maybe love, maybe guilt, maybe both. Whatever it was, it had begun, and nothing would be the same again. The next morning, Richard stood at his office window. Staring down at the busy streets below, cars moved like ants. People rushed to work, phones rang. And the world spun on as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. He had a grandson. And the face of that little boy would not leave his mind. Micah had his son's smile, his same stubborn eyebrows, and the same way of tilting his head when thinking. Richard had only spent a few minutes with him. Yet it felt like something inside his chest had opened, something heavy and soft at the same time. He hadn't felt that in years. He sat at his desk, pulled out his phone, and stared at Michael's last known number. It was disconnected now. Of course, but still, he tapped on old text messages, rereading words from long ago. Some were warm, some were angry. Most were filled with distance. Regret crept in like a slow storm. Richard had wasted so much time being proud. By noon, he couldn't sit still. He called his driver and asked to be taken to the downtown lab. He had quietly taken a used spoon from Mika's school snack and a comb from Elena's bag when she wasn't looking. Not to steal, but to be sure, he needed proof, not for his sake, but for the world that would question this boy's place in the Langston legacy. The technician didn't ask many questions. Money did that. He promised results in 2 days. Richard nodded and left with a pounding heart. 2 days had never felt so long. That night, he dreamed of Michael, not as a grown man, but as a little boy holding his hand in the garden, asking questions about stars. Then suddenly, the boy turned into Micah, looking up at him with the same wonder in his eyes. Richard woke up with tears on his face, and for the first time in years, he didn't wipe them away. The following day, he visited the diner again. Elena looked surprised, but not upset. She brought him coffee, and they sat in the same booth as before. They didn't talk about DNA or business or legacy. They talked about Michael. She told him about the time Michael had helped her move apartments in the rain, carrying boxes with a bad back. And making jokes the whole time, she talked about how he loved jazz music and always tapped his fingers when he was nervous. Richard listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes closing his eyes like he was holding on to every word. He was scared of becoming a father. She said quietly, but he wanted to try. He said he didn't want to make the same mistakes you made, Richard. Flinched but nodded. "I deserved that," he whispered. "I wasn't the father he needed." "You were the father he had," Elena replied gently. "And now you have a chance to do better if you want it." "I do," Richard said, his voice firm and filled with something close to hope. "I want to know him. I want to help, not just with money, but with time, with presence." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then come pick him up from school tomorrow. We'll tell him who you are." The words hit Richard like a wave. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he wanted it more than anything. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for not hiding him from me forever. I tried." She said with a soft smile, "But he has your eyes. I should have known someone would notice eventually." The next day came with nervous energy. Richard wore a sweater instead of his usual suit, something more casual, something less billionaire. He waited by the school gate again, this time with butterflies in his stomach. Elena arrived, with Mika holding his hand, and the boy looked curious but calm. Elena knelt down. her arm around Micah's shoulders. "Baby," she said gently, "do you remember the man you met at the diner?" Micah nodded, the one with the lion eyes. She smiled. "Yes, that man. It's your grandfather. He's your daddy's daddy." Micah blinked, looking at Richard again, this time with new eyes. "Really? Aha." He asked, "You're my grandpa." Richard knelt down, his voice shaky. "If you want me to be," he whispered. "I'd be proud to be." Micah thought for a moment, then reached out his hand and said, "Okay, but do grandpas know how to play video games?" Richard chuckled, tears stinging his eyes. "I'll learn," he said. "I'll learn anything you want." The boy smiled and grabbed his hand, and in that moment, Richard felt something stronger than wealth, stronger than business, stronger. Then grief, he felt belonging. As they walked away together, Alina followed behind, her heart full of fear and hope mixed together. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone, and neither did Micah. Richard sat in his car that evening, the little boy's tiny handprint still pressed against the glass window from earlier. Micah had touched it before saying goodbye, and somehow, that small print meant more than all the gold rings on Richard's fingers. It felt real. It felt like family. He didn't drive home right away. Instead, he asked his driver to take him to Michael's grave again. The sun was low now, casting a soft orange light over the cemetery. The wind was gentle, and the trees rustled, as if they were whispering secrets of their own. Richard walked to the stone the same way he always did, but this time, he wasn't alone in the world. He sat on the bench near the grave and took a deep breath. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "He's so much like you, but brighter, stronger. Even without us." He placed a photo of Micah in front of the grave, the one Alina had given him, and stared at it for a long while. "I didn't know," he continued, "but I will know him now. I'll do it right. This time. I promise you, Michael." 2 days later, Richard received a call from the lab. The DNA test was back. The voice on the phone was calm and professional, but the words hit Richard like thunder. "It's a match," they said. "He's your biological grandson, without a doubt." Richard didn't cry this time. He smiled, just a soft, quiet smile. He already knew in his heart, but now the world would know too. Micah Langston was real, and he belonged to him. He called Elena that evening and asked if they could talk. Not at the diner, not on the phone, but face to face. She agreed, and they met in the small park near her apartment. It was quiet, and Micah was playing on the swings while they sat on a bench nearby. "I got the results," Richard said gently. Alina turned to him, her face unreadable. "He's mine," he added. "I mean, he's my blood, just like I knew." Alina nodded slowly. "He always was," she said softly. "I just didn't think you'd care." "I didn't care about many things before," Richard admitted. "I was too focused on my empire, my money, my pride, and I missed my son slipping away. I won't do it again. What do you want from us?" Alina asked carefully, "Because I can't have you come into his life and then disappear." "I want to be there," Richard said. "I want to pick him up from school sometimes. Take him to the zoo. Show him my world, not the rich part. The real part, I want to read books to him at night, and maybe one day teach him how to ride a bike." Alina stared at him for a long moment, then looked at Micah on the swing. He was laughing now, kicking his legs in the air, free and innocent. "He doesn't know what it means to have a grandfather," she whispered. "But he's starting to smile more since you came around." Richard's eyes filled again, but he blinked the tears away. "I'll do anything to keep that smile on his face," he said. "Even if that means earning it every day." The next few weeks moved like a dream. Richard started showing up every Saturday morning with pancakes, storybooks, or little model kits to build with Micah. He never came empty-handed, but not because he wanted to by love, because he wanted to build it piece by piece, Micah warmed. Up to him fast. Children can feel what's real, and the boy knew. He'd run to the door when Richard arrived. Tug on his hand and ask him questions nonstop. Did you have a dog when you were a kid? Did my daddy like robots? Do all rich. People eat soup with gold spoons. Alina watched them grow close, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She still worked at the diner, still wore tired shoes and counted coins at the end of the week. But now, her son had a family beyond. Her, someone strong and steady. Someone who looked at Micah like he was the most important boy in the world. One night, as they all sat in the living room, Micah curled up between them. Richard looked at Alina and said softly, "There's something else I want to do, if you'll let me." She turned to him, curious. "What is it?" "I want to make it official," he said. "I want to put Micah's name in the Langston family records. Give him the name. Give him access to everything that's his by right. School, protection, future, all of it." Elena's eyes widened. "You mean? Legally?" "Yes," Richard nodded. "I want the world to know who he is. Not hidden, not whispered about, but claimed, fully and proudly." Elena's voice caught in her throat. She looked down at Micah, now asleep against her arm, then back. "At Richard, he'll be proud to carry that name," she whispered, "but only if it comes with love, not just title." Richard smiled, reaching out to gently fix the blanket on the boy's lap. "He already has my heart," he said. "The name is just the beginning." Richard stood outside the courthouse, his hands in his pockets. The city moved around him like always, people walking fast, horns honking, traffic lights blinking, but his world felt slower today, heavier and strangely brighter. Today was the day everything would change again. He looked down at the documents in his briefcase. One page had Micah's full name, and soon it would have the Langston name beside it. Not because of power, not because of pressure, but because of love. Richard had already spoken to his lawyers, made sure everything was clean, respectful, and legal. No tricks, no fine print. Alina stepped out of the taxi across the street. Micah holding her hand, his small backpack bounced with every step, and his smile grew when he saw Richard. He let go of his mother's hand and ran across the sidewalk, yelling, "Grandpa, we're here." Richard knelt down, laughing as Micah hugged him tight. "I see that," he said. "You ready to sign some grown-up papers today?" Micah nodded. "Wide-eyed will it make me a knight?" "Oh, even better." Richard smiled. "It'll make you a Langston." Alina walked over slowly, her expression calm but unsure. She hadn't grown up with trust in the system, and paperwork scared her more than words ever did. But she saw the care in Richard's face, not the coldness of wealth or pride, just the quiet love of a man trying to fix his past by showing up now. They walked into the building together, sat in a quiet room with warm lights and calm voices. The judge was kind, not too formal, and spoke gently to Micah as if he were part of everything, which he was. Alina signed first, then Richard. Their names on the page were like stitching on a wound that had been open far too long. When it was done, Micah held the papers in his little hands and said, "Does this mean we're really family now?" Alina nodded, eyes misty. "We always were, baby, but now the world knows it too." Richard took them out to dinner that evening, not to a fancy place, but to a family diner near the park. They ordered burgers and fries, and Richard even wore jeans. Micah made jokes, told stories about school, and asked if he could visit Richard's big house soon. "You want to see the piano your dad used to play?" Richard asked. "It's still there?" Micah's eyes lit up. "My dad played piano." "He did." Richard smiled. "Not very well, but he tried hard. He'd hit wrong notes and laugh like it was part of the music." Alina smiled across the table. "That sounds like him." After dinner, they went for a walk through the park. It was quiet, the lights soft, and the air smelled like fresh grass and early spring. Micah ran ahead, chasing fireflies, his laughter echoing through the night. Alina and Richard walked slowly behind him. "I never imagined this," Alina said quietly. "That you'd be like this with him? That you'd care this much?" "I didn't either," Richard replied. "But the moment I saw him, it was like getting a second chance I didn't deserve." "You're earning it," she said. "Every visit, every story, every promise you've kept." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Richard said something he'd been thinking about for weeks. "What if we moved you both closer to me?" Alina looked up quickly. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to take him from you," Richard said quickly. "Never that, but I have space. A guest house, a good school nearby. You wouldn't have to work double shifts. You could rest. Focus on your dreams too." Alina didn't answer right away. Her life had been built on survival, on doing everything alone, trusting someone else with her future. Her son's future, that was terrifying, but she looked at Richard, really looked at him, and saw no control, no pressure, only care. "I'll think about it," she whispered. "That's all I ask." Richard said. That night, Richard dropped them off at their apartment. Micah had fallen asleep in the back seat, holding the new Langston family photo in his hands, a picture of all three of them taken at the courthouse steps. Alina carried him upstairs while Richard waited at the door, watching them disappear into the hallway as he returned to his car. He looked up at the sky, the stars starting to peek out. "Thank you, Michael," he whispered to the night. "Your son is amazing, and I promise you, I won't let him feel alone again." The driver didn't ask where to go next. He just drove quietly, letting his boss sit in the back seat, smiling to himself like a man who had just found a piece of his soul that had been missing too long. Weeks passed, and everything began to change, slowly but in the right way. Alina agreed to visit Richard's estate with Micah one weekend, just to see. She had expected tall gates, cold rooms, and people with tight smiles. But instead, the house felt warm, like someone had lived there and missed laughter for too long. Micah ran through the hallways like they were a maze. Amazed by the tall bookshelves and the grand piano in the music room, he sat at the keys and tapped them gently. "Was this my daddy's piano?" he asked. Richard knelt beside him, smiling. "Yes, he used to play it just like that." With 2 fingers and a lot of noise, Micah giggled and tapped louder. "Then I'm doing it right." Upstairs, the guest house was more than Alina expected. It had its own kitchen, soft beds, and sunlight pouring in through the windows. She looked around slowly, not saying anything at first. But her silence wasn't rejection, it was shock. The quiet kind that comes when someone shows you more kindness than you're used to. "There's no pressure," Richard said gently, "but this could be yours, a place to breathe, afresh." Alina sat on the edge of the bed, looking down at her hands. "I've worked since I was 16. She said. "Double shifts, night jobs, shared apartments. I never imagined a space like this." "You deserve peace," Richard said. "And so does Micah." That night, they stayed over for the first time. Micah slept in the room next to Richard's, and Richard told him a bedtime story, not from a book, but a memory. He told Micah about the time Michael got stuck trying to climb a tree to impress a girl, how he cried out, and how Richard had to bring a ladder. Laughing the whole time, Micah laughed too. "Sounds like something I'd do. You're more like him than you know," Richard said, kissing the boy's forehead. "But smarter already." Downstairs, Alina watched from the hallway, her heart tight and full at the same time. She had never seen a man speak about Michael like that. Not even Michael's own friends. There was no pretending in Richard's voice, just love, regret, and pride. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Richard in the kitchen, awkwardly trying to make pancakes, flour on his jacket sleeves. "You're going to burn that?" she said with a smile. "I already did," he chuckled, pointing to the blackened pile in the trash. She stepped closer, looked him in the eyes, and said, "We'll move in, not because we need saving, but because we need space to grow. And this feels right, Richard." Nodded, hiding the relief on his face. "I'll have the paperwork ready," he said. "No contracts. Just clarity, just safety within the week." Alina and Micah moved into the guest house, not as charity cases, but as family. Micah got into a good school nearby, made new friends, and came home with drawings of superheroes and spaceships. He started calling Richard Grandpa without thinking about it. And Richard never corrected him, only smiled wider each time. 1. Sunday, while walking through the garden. Micah asked a question that made both adults stop. "Can we go visit my daddy's grave again?" Alina looked at Richard, unsure, but Richard nodded. "Yes, of course." They returned to the cemetery together. The three of them. Micah held flowers this time, blue ones, his favorite color. He placed them gently on the stone and sat quietly. Alina and Richard stood behind him, letting the moment be his. "Hi, Daddy," Micah said softly. "I'm doing okay now. I've got Mommy and Grandpa, and I'm learning piano. And I made a new friend at school named Jay, who likes the same cartoons." He paused, then whispered, "I miss you, even though I didn't get to meet you. But I think you're watching." Alina wiped a tear from her cheek. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and calm. When they left the cemetery, something felt complete, not perfect, but full, like a missing piece had finally been found and placed where it belonged. Back at home, that evening, Richard sat in his chair by the fire, Micah asleep on his chest, Alina sipping tea nearby. He looked at them and felt something he hadn't felt since Michael was a child, the feeling of a home. Not just a house, not just a fortune, but real, breathing love. "I wasted years," Richard said quietly. "But I'm not wasting the rest," Alina nodded. "And we're not running anymore." They didn't know what the future would bring. But they knew one thing for sure. Family was no longer broken. It had been bent, hidden, and nearly lost. But now it was standing again, and for the first time in a long time, it felt unshakable. The air was warm, and the garden smelled of fresh grass and blooming flowers. It had been 1 full year since Richard first saw Alina and Micah near his son's grave. 1 year since the truth had changed his life forever. Today, that memory returned, but not with pain. With peace. Micah was in the backyard, wearing a little suit and running around with a paper airplane. Alina stood nearby, fixing the collar of her dress, and Richard walked out holding a box wrapped in gold ribbon. He looked lighter now, younger in spirit, even though his silver hair still showed his age. "I can't believe it's been a year," Alina said softly, watching Micah play. "Sometimes it still feels like a dream." "It does," Richard nodded. "But it's a good one." He handed her the gift box and motioned for her to open it. Inside was a photo book, filled with pictures. From the past year, their first visit to the zoo, Kay's first day at his new school, pancake breakfasts, bedtime stories. Even a photo of the three of them planting a tree beside Michael's grave. Alina held the book close to her chest, her eyes wet with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. For all of it, Richard looked at her, then at Micah, who now waved a stick like a sword and shouted at invisible dragons. "You gave me back more than you know," he said. "You gave me family again." Later that evening, they all went back to the cemetery. Just like the first time, but this time they brought chairs, candles, and a blanket to sit on. Micah held a letter he had written, folded neatly in his small hand. He sat beside the gravestone and read it softly. "Hi, Daddy," Micah said. "It's me, Micah. I hope you can hear me. I've been doing really good. Grandpa helps me with homework, and Mom lets me eat pancakes on Fridays. I miss you, but I'm not sad anymore. Because I know you're part of me." Alina wiped her eyes. Richard placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was full of meaning after the letter. They lit the candles around the stone, letting the warm glow fill the space. Richard looked up at the sky. "I promised you I'd be better," he whispered, "and I will be, every day, for him." They sat there for a long time, until the stars began to appear. Micah leaned against his mother's arm and yawned. "I'm sleepy," he said. "Can we go home?" "Yes, baby," Alina said softly. "Let's go home," as they walked. Back to the car, Micah looked up at Richard and asked, "Can we come back next year too?" "Every year," Richard smiled. "Every year and every day you want, back at the estate." Micah fell asleep in his bed with his stuffed lion and a book about stars. Richard and Alina sat on the porch, looking out at the night, the garden. Lights twinkled, and the wind carried the scent of roses through the air. "I still don't know how we got here," Alina said quietly. "From a diner, from a graveyard. It's from two different worlds." Richard looked at her. "We didn't come from different worlds," he said. "We were just waiting to find each other." Alina smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes, full of calm and trust. "Micah is lucky," she said. "We all are." Richard replied inside the house. A small frame sat on the mantel above. The fireplace, it held a photo of Michael, young and smiling. Beside a newer photo, Micah, with the same smile holding Richard's hand. The past and present side by side, not broken anymore, not lost. Just part of the same story, completed, and from that day on, they didn't call each other step or by blood or half. They just called each other family.